Hello, my name is Marshall Chasin. I'm an audiologist. I'm a clinical audiologist, although I'm involved in clinically based research. Um, Today's talk is about digital delay, once again. In other words, when we thought we had the problem solved, maybe we don't. So let's have an overview of this interesting topic. The learner outcomes that have been supplied as a result of this course, participants will be able to know the digital delay of a range of accessories and smartphone apps, at least as published by the manufacturers that are marketing these devices. You should be able to calculate the acoustic delay of unamplified speech and music as a function of distance. This is Audiology 101, but something that audio engineers are intimately concerned about, as should we be, and also provide clinically relevant strategies for our hard of hearing clients, such as maybe when not to use lip reading, when that could be maybe problematical. This is nothing to do with digital delay. This is just acoustical delay. Sound has a finite speed. It's in English, it's 340 meters per second. If you live in Canada and pretty much the rest of the world, if you live in the United States, Liberia, or Myanmar, they use the imperial system, and so instead of it being 340 meters per second, it's 1100 and 125. So it's 1125 feet per second. Most of the acoustical equations um, are done in metric. And when you do that, and when you use 340, things work out beautifully well with nice even numbers. But regardless, there is a difference. So every 1.1 feet is 1 millisecond delay. That is, it takes sound to travel 1.1 feet, and it's about 1 millisecond. So more generally, you can see in the slide, after about a meter or 3.3 feet, it's about 3 milliseconds, and this increases up to maybe about 18 or 20 milliseconds at 6 or 7 meters, or about 20 feet roughly. So there is a natural acoustical delay. Traditionally, acoustical engineers have been very concerned about this, especially in the music venue, where somebody may have a very poor seat, they smash the cymbals, and the listener doesn't really get to hear that until a little bit after their visual clue that the cymbal has smashed together, and that can degrade one's enjoyment of music. Trivia regarding the imperial metric systems. By the way, Canada, where I'm from, went on the metric system when I was in grade 10, or you guys would say 10th grade, in the early 1970s, because you said that you were, the Americans said that you were, and you chickened out at the last moment. But in 1793, your President Thomas Jefferson really wanted to change to the US metric system. So he called up his friends in the French government, and they sent a scientist named Joseph Dombey to the United States, complete with a 1 kilogram brass standard to use to convert over. But pirates, or privateers as they were then called, from England or the United Kingdom, captured him, imprisoned him, and he eventually died. And by the time that the French government had heard and realized this, the U.S. Was under a new president who is no longer as interested in converting to the metric system. And as I said, the three countries today, and this is a trivia question, you can use the parties, Liberia, Myanmar, and the United States are the three that use the imperial system to this day. Um, and that's why you have the difference between the two. Um, Beyond around about 6 or 7 feet, about 2 or 3 meters, lip reading clues tend to gradually decline and are less accessible in any event. In other words, by the time there's any acoustical delay, the listener, the lip reader, can no longer really lip read or understand what is going on in the face because they are so physically far away. So the visual cues become less of a distraction to what they are hearing. So there's a natural limit, which is a good limit, that by the time you get such significant acoustical delays, you're no longer affected by the acoustical or the visual acoustical mismatch that does occur at larger distances. So it's not that big of an issue. But we do know that speech, and this is from a study that came out just several months ago, December 2025. They looked at several aspects or elements of acoustical delay and how it affects speech as a function of distance. So in these graphs here, as a function of 1 meter distance, 50 meter, or 100 meter distances, 100 meter being about 350 feet roughly. As you can see, when it's relatively up close, the intelligibility is well maintained. The intelligibility does degrade significantly with a lot of variability by the time you get up to 300 or 400 feet, 100 meters. And that has to do with reflections that naturally occur in a room that cover over or mask what you want to hear. So the receiving of maybe earlier or later reflections, it can be as little as 50 milliseconds delayed, and sometimes that can degrade the speech. Sometimes, though, that same early reflection can enhance music. So maybe what is good for music is not necessarily good for speech. So it becomes a little bit more complicated. Also, the syllable duration increases substantially. Again, not that it's articulated at a bigger distance, but there's more reflections that add. You hear the echo as well as the incident sound. So there's an inherent problem, but also an inherent limitation with speech from a distance. If you look at music per se, though, although it's not that big of an issue with speech, other than the normal degradation, music can really be ruined if something is out of visual sync. So, as I said before, if you do hear a cymbal being clashed around, and you don't hear the cymbal until a fraction of a second later, that can be problematical. So at 50 meters, the acoustical delay in a performance hall can be 1/6 of a second delay, 150 milliseconds. So the audible experience is out of sync with the visual performance. And audio engineers know that. And if they try to have loudspeakers or some sort of electrical amplification, sound reinforcement, they would want to know this. And so they want to make sure that even the people in the cheap seats, like ZZ25 and ZZ26 at the very back where I can afford sometimes, still sounds pretty good. So that can be a little bit problematic. So if you're in the bad seats, you do pay less. It's almost worthwhile paying a little bit more to get in C14 and C15 on the third row center or something like that for that. That's an inherent problem with acoustics, nothing to do with hearing or hearing aids or anything like that. This is some of the seats that I can afford to be in, and you're not going to have the same acoustical experience. Now, having reviewed the natural acoustics given the finite and relatively low speed of sound, let's talk about the topic digital delay. So, as recently as 8 to 10 years ago, due to the technology of hearing aids, for just the analog to digitization conversion, A to D converter of a hearing aid, and then the digital to analog without any other DSP, no other algorithms, no noise control, no feedback management, no nonlinear compression, none of the algorithms at all, just for the A to D and then back to DDA, without any digital signal processing, the digital delay was on the order of 5 to 6 milliseconds. However, today, the same process only takes 1/100th of that time, 50 microseconds, and that means 1/20th of 1 millisecond, so a small fraction of 1 millisecond to do that same thing. So we've almost solved this problem, or we think we've almost solved this problem. And indeed, we have hearing aids with programs that have digital delays on the order of less than 1 millisecond. And so we've solved the problem essentially, or so we thought. There are 5 articles. There have been more, but these are the 5 articles that the hearing aid industry has grabbed onto, and they're listed as Roman numerals one to 5, mostly by Michael Stone and Brian Moore in University of Cambridge, and they appeared in Ear and Hearing, a very reputable journal in our field, between 1999 and 2008. And you can see they all have very similar names like tolerable hearing aid delays for estimation of limits for open canal fittings, effects of subjective disturbance on speech production, the effects of speech production and perception of a cross frequency variation and delay, estimation of limits imposed during speech production, and estimation of limits imposed by the auditory path alone using simulated hearing losses. So the first one, the one that I just mentioned there from 1999, really had nothing to do with digital delay. It was just delay that happens in our human auditory system. If you haven't gone through these articles, they're all online for free. You just type in pubmed.org, which is the American National Institutes for the Health site. You can obtain them if you don't have a subscription to Ear and Hearing. Summary really of what they found is that they found that in dry, acoustically well-controlled environments, you only needed a digital delay of less than 15 milliseconds, and you really didn't notice any deleterious effects of them. So the numbers are much higher than what normal A to D and D to A converter based chips, IC chips today. In an echoey environment, you need it a little bit longer. And even if the digital delay or any delay, uh, a digital and acoustic delay together, when we talk about delay, if it's less than 30 milliseconds, which is still very short, speech production is not affected. In contrast, by the way, if you have a delay of on the order of 125 milliseconds, that can cause a fluent person such as myself to stutter, but also a stuttering person to become fluent. And there is technology out there where they wear what looks like a hearing aid, but it measures their own vocal output, delays it by 1/8 of a second, 125 milliseconds, and that person can become more fluent. I remember when I was in grad school, we did this experiment on me, and I became completely disfluent, and it lasted about a week. I had complete disfluency, and actually today, not that I'm blaming my slight disfluency on that incident, but even today I have some disfluency in my voice. So you don't want to have too long of a delay, acoustical or digital delay. Carry on though, if it's less than 9 milliseconds, there's no errors in speech identification, place, and manner. By the way, the reason why I said above, less than 30 milliseconds, that speech production is not affected. You also hear your own voice and make little changes to it. And also, the final one is has to be less than 5 millisecond digital delay in an open, non-occluding fitting, such as a receiver in the canal, because you get constructive and destructive interference adding up the sound level and decreasing the sound level, causing what we call comb filtering. Now, comb filtering has been a major reason articulated by many of the engineers and many of the manufacturers because many of the fittings that we do are non-occluding. That is, the vast majority of our clientele have relatively good hearing in the lower frequencies at 500 hertz and 250, and maybe only a little bit of a hearing loss at 1000 hertz. So these people are ideal candidates for open and non-occluding fittings. But comb filtering has been a major concern, so they wanted to minimize acoustical delay. This is a measure of comb filtering, not the solid blue one, but the one that seems to go up and down in the lower frequencies, especially. But you do get it into the mid and higher frequencies where you have this amplified combining with a non-amplified signal, and depending on the digital delay between the two or the delay between the two, you're going to get some comb filtering. This picture looks ugly, and not a criticism to the engineers that are listening in, but if you listen to this in sound field, humans are relatively insensitive to these peaks. That is, as long as these peaks are less than 10 or 12 decibels in magnitude, you can't hear them. Under earphones, well-defined earphones, you may be able to hear them, but people usually listen acoustically in the sound field, not from the earphone. So even though comb filtering may sound a bit rough under earphones and the picture looks downright ugly, I think comb filtering is slightly overly stated, and that a little bit of digital delay or a little bit of delay, especially even with an open fitting, clinically, I haven't found any deleterious effect. And I fit many people, many hard of hearing people with golden ears. These are musicians and sound engineers over the years, and they know when something is off. If I told them there's comb filtering, they may in fact say, oh, yes, they hear something. But generally, unless you tell them there's comb filtering, and they usually understand what I mean by that, there's not a lot that they can say or do about it. Modern hearing aid accessories, and this is part of the title. Once again, now we have hearing aids that are so efficient in terms of the delay that it provides digitally. We have accessories. That is, every hearing aid that I prescribe and I fit as a clinical audiologist usually comes with at least one accessory. And accessories may be something as simple as a TV listening device, where the device sits on your TV, converts the sound into Bluetooth, which is then picked up by the hearing aid. Well, that device, although it's a wonderful device, actually has a little bit of a delay. And from the manufacturer specs, it's not unusual to have them on the order of about 30 milliseconds. So you have to add that to the any other digital delay that a person may get. Also, there may be proprietary links from certain manufacturers that you might use for phone call use or even streaming, and that could be a little bit different. It could be higher with one than the other, and that can add up another 10 milliseconds of digital delay. So everything is starting to add with some of these devices. Also, there are some manufacturers. I use the phrase E2E. E2E is a WSA thing, a wide exsignia phenomena, ear to ear. I think it first came out there when it was used to. The old technology was from Siemens, so it's been around since the 80s actually, where there's some ear to ear. Back then, they would call it crossover, some radio communication between the two ears. But many of the manufacturers are using single microphone devices such as CICs. If it's fit binaurally, there is some crossover that occurs that can give it some of the properties of directionality. Usually with directional microphones that suppress sound from the rear direction, you need at least two microphones, if not more, in this beam forming method. But they've been able to do it with ear-to-ear communication, with suppressing the sound from the rear direction very effectively. But that does, depending on the manufacturer and how it's implemented, can also add on several more milliseconds of digital delay. Also, many smartphone apps are available now that you can use with or without your hearing aid. They're noise stripping apps. That usually you can use them in a very noisy environment, and they have digital delays, but they're typically on the order of 50 to 80 milliseconds. And again, that is from the manufacturer. An example is Heard That, which is, you can see the URL. I believe there's a 30-day trial period, and then after that there's a subscription. I think it's on the order of about $100 Canadian a year. But at least you'll have 30 days that you could try it out and see if that helps for you. You may find that the benefits of the noise reduction far outweigh the digital delay that that thing imparts in your system. We have the advent of Bluetooth low energy audio. I do want to point out something. If you're not an audiologist that's listening, there's a lot of jargon in our field, and we've had low energy Bluetooth LE for many years. Bluetooth LE audio may sound like the old LE, but it's actually a different thing, and it's a much improved. With Auracast, another form of Bluetooth that's coming down the pipeline, that also promises to also minimize that delay that is there. This is from an article that I'd written in ENT and Audiology News, which is a trade magazine that is published in the United Kingdom, England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, Northern Ireland, I should say. Um, and this is from last October 2025. And it's just a review of some of the sources of potential digital delay. Digital hearing aids can be 1 to 8 milliseconds. Accessories such as TV listening devices, as reported by the manufacturers, is on the order of about 30 milliseconds. Smartphone apps, if you use those, can be 70 milliseconds. And even some algorithms within hearing aids are 15 to 50 milliseconds. So, for example, noise reduction apps, which are very important and have a great effect, especially in noisy locations, the way they work is that they take a sample of the environment, then they wait a moment of time, 15 to 50 milliseconds on that order. They sample a second time, and then they do a correlation, or what we call an autocorrelation, between the two elements. And if there's a correlation between them in any way, that is the signal, whether it's speech or music. If there's no correlation, that's a hallmark of noise, and it says, okay, I'm going to reduce that noise level because the correlation is very low. But as you can see from my explanation, there is a period of time that it has to take those different samples. That's the most rudimentary form, but there are some algorithms that do contribute or add to digital delay somewhat. There are actually two types of processing, digital processing in the hearing aid industry. And these are the two types in speech analysis. If you ever have taken a course in speech analysis, or if you're interested in speech synthesis, there are two major methods of analyzing or converting from the time domain to the frequency domain. One is what's called a Fourier analysis. 1832 is when Fourier developed this mathematical technique. It's based on an infinite series. In the 1960s, there are a couple of engineers, Tukey and for the life of me, I can't remember the other gentleman's name. But Tukey is the same guy that in statistics, you see the Tukey distribution. But there's two gentlemen, and his family's going to come back and beat me up for not mentioning his name. My apologies. But they came out with a computer algorithm called FFT. It's a formula, the fast Fourier transform. And that converts from the time domain to the frequency domain so that we can look at it and do some frequency shaping later on with kind of digital forms of tone control. But if you use an FFT, the delay is the same for low frequencies, mid frequencies, and high frequencies, such as the Heard That app, which has a digital delay of 80 milliseconds. And so that would affect all the sounds equally. The vast majority of hearing aid manufacturers use a band filters where they have a band, let's say low frequency, and they look at the energy in that band, and they would treat that differently in the higher band, in a higher band. And they can actually segment like the different notes on the piano keyboard going from low to high individually. And this band of filters, with that technique, the digital delay is always greater for lower frequency sounds than higher frequency sounds. Now, when you're getting digital delays on the order of 1 millisecond, it doesn't matter whether it was 1 millisecond versus a half of a millisecond. It's very, very low. But there are some situations where in the lower frequencies you can have longer digital delays than the higher frequencies. So you have to be concerned about that. For speech, I don't think that there's a big issue, but for music, there may be a larger issue. And this is speech, and this is maybe an explanation of why it's not a big issue for speech. Speech in our literature, and if you talk to most people in the field, is considered a wide band signal. Wide meaning it has stuff on the middle of the piano keyboard where your fundamental frequency is, where some of the vowels ah, e, r, versus the right-hand side of the piano keyboard, the top notes, which are very close to the S's and the SH's. So it spans that entire middle to right-hand side of the piano keyboard. However, speech is actually either low frequency, that is middle of the piano keyboard, or the top right-hand side of the piano keyboard at any one point in time, but never both. So if I say the word at, the a is a sonorant, it's a vowel, it has resonant structure around, in the case of a, energy ranging from about 400 hertz for its first resonant peak up to maybe it's a low vowel, so a front vowel, so it's probably very low as well, maybe about 12 or 1500 hertz at most. So it's usually down in the mid to the first couple octaves above middle C of the piano keyboard. But the t is higher frequency, like the S's and the SH's and the other consonant sounds, which are all nearer to the top end of the piano keyboard. In fact, S doesn't even start until that top note of the piano keyboard. That's where it begins, and then it goes right of the top end of the piano keyboard. And so at speech, you'll never have t or s at the same time that you'll have ah or e or o. So you either have at lower frequency, the vowels or the ends and nasals and all that, or higher, the consonants, but never both at the same time. So at any one point in time, you might have the consonants starting a little bit sooner than the vowels would, but it's so slight that it's completely unintelligible. In fact, it will be unintelligible if it's probably less than about 8 or 10 milliseconds. Music, though, is different because at any one point in time, music truly is broadband. That is, you can have both low frequency fundamental and higher frequency harmonics. In fact, that's the nature of music, that it's the relationship between the lower frequencies and the higher frequencies that are so important. So you're having the fundamental having a slightly different digital delay, a longer digital delay than some of the harmonic structures. So you may in fact be able to perceive in some cases the harmonics before the fundamental. And that can be problematic for music, but it should be okay for speech. I'd written for music. Um, so these are some recommendations that I give my patients. And again, I'm a clinical audiologist. While it's true that hearing aid algorithms and accessories and other technologies with shorter delays are gradually emerging, what should we tell them right now in 2026 at the current time? Do an experiment. Find yourself in a very noisy place where you use some of these noise stripping algorithms and try an experiment in which they close their eyes. In other words, remove the lip reading, the visual clues, and just see if it's any better. It may be actually better to close your eyes and just listen to the sound with the improved signal to noise ratio rather than being distracted by visual cues that may be a little bit off. In the olden days, of course, before digital hearing aids, you were limited by distance. You would never have that problem because by the time something is so delayed, you couldn't see it anyway. Up close with some of these digital AI based algorithms, it could be problematic. So do the experiment. It may be a problem for some, maybe not a problem for others. Everyone is a little bit different. Also, consider having a hearing aid program that can be used for music and speech, where most of the advanced features, such as noise reduction, are disabled. So even though the hearing aid nominally has a digital delay of 5 or 3 or 1 or even less than 1 milliseconds, that won't be the case with some of the more advanced noise reduction techniques are involved. And also try to attend performance halls if you are going to listen to live music, where they use a loop system, an inductive system, because unlike some of the Bluetooth and systems, inductive transmission through a loop, through a telecoil, actually has no digital delay, has no delay at all. It's instantaneous. And so if you're going to attend classical music, where it's the fine form of it is so, and the temporal basing of it is so important to listen to it well and to enjoy it, you may want to, but if you do need some telecoil assistance through an inductive loop, seek out those performance halls that have an inductive system rather than anything else where the transmission may have some delay. And that's from that same article, A Return to Digital Delay from ENT and Audiology News in October of 2025. Finishing off, I have to show this picture. It's not my claim to fame, but I happen to be able to stand right next to the most famous violin in the world. This is the Stradivarius red violin. The idea is that Stradivarius, when he manufactured this violin, his wife unfortunately passed, and they used her blood in the varnish to give it the red hue. They've done genetic testing. It's certainly not the case. But this is Elizabeth Picarin, who is the current owner of the Felix Mendelssohn red violin. Samuel Jackson did a movie in 1990 or 91 called The Red Violin, all about its life history. I got very close. I had to take down this 12-year-old kid that was acting as security in this little regional performance hall. She was teaching a summer course up in the Adirondack Mountains up in New York, and I managed to bully my way into getting very close, but I was not allowed to touch it. That's why my hands are in my pocket. If there are any questions, this is my email, marshall.chasin@rogers.com, or my website has a lot of audio files on digital delay at musiciansclinics.com. Thank you.